Hi there, everyone. We're just giving folks a minute or so to get filtered into the Zoom here, and then we'll get started. I was going to say this morning because it's morning for me, but I know we have an international audience hopefully this morning. So whatever time it is for you. All right, it looks like things have slowed down a little bit in the waiting room, so I think let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, welcome everyone. My name is Vanessa St. Ogerman, and I have the pleasure of being one of the co-chairs for SAA's Crisis, Disaster, and Tragedy Response Working Group. Thank you for taking some time during your day to join us for what is the working group's first public talk. And we are so pleased to be starting this series. Particular thanks have to go to working group members, Kostas Arvanitis, who you will hear from later today, as well as Scott Grimwood and Rebecca Tinker. So just a little bit of housekeeping as usual with these sorts of things before we get started. So this event is being recorded and we will make it available for later viewing on the working group's microsite. SAA also has integrated live captioning available for all of these Zoom events using Otter AI. So participants can access that transcript by selecting the drop-down menu in the live box, which should be appearing at the left corner of your Zoom screen. It may look different depending on what kind of device you're on, but please note that the transcript will open in a separate browser window. So as always, please make sure that you have yourself muted during the speaker's presentation to avoid any unexpected interruptions. And then we'll have time at the end of today's presentation for some Q&A, about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of today's presentation. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's program, who are going to be sharing their work developing archiving disaster support group records, a guide for support groups and professionals. So with us today, we have Dr. Kostas Arvanitis. I told you I was going to mess it up, Kostas, I'm sorry. He's a senior lecturer in museology at the University of Manchester and has been researching museum practices on collecting and documenting spontaneous memorials related to traumatic events, including the Manchester Arena attack of May 22nd, 2017. Dr. Eyre of the Center for Collective Trauma is a sociologist specializing in trauma and disaster management, as well as the liaison officer for disaster action. And Jen Kavanagh is an independent curator and oral historian who specializes in contemporary and community collecting and has delivered projects related to the July 7th, 2005 London bombing. Also joining us today from their team is Jelena Watkins, who is a trustee of the September 11 UK Family Support Group and a psychotherapist specializing in disaster trauma. Dr. Andy Hardman of Bellevue Productions and the University of Manchester is also a collaborator on this project, but was unfortunately unable to join us today. So now I will hand things over to the three of you to get us started for today's presentation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm going to share my slides, diving right into it, and I will be operating the slides while also Jen speak. But I'll kick off with some notes about the project itself and where it came from before Anne and Jen talk about the guide in itself and the two parts of the guide itself. A few things first about the September 11 UK Families Support Group, which the kind of collaboration with kicked off this project and led to the development of the guide that we will present today. So the support group was founded in 2002 by and for the UK families who lost loved ones in September 11, and the organization's aim is to provide a forum for mutual support of the UK 9/11 families. The reasons for the group's formation were to, well, one of them was that access to information from a distance was difficult and also complicated legally financial issues and administrative burden stressful for international families, which kind of prompted the formation of this group, as well as poor access to humanitarian help. But at the same time, the expenditure was kind of very high. And quite importantly, the need to be with others in a similar situation. Over the last 20 or more years now, the group has organized anniversary commemorations, has led on advocacy, especially in relation to the way the 9/11 and the people who were killed were remembered and are being remembered, organized information meetings for members and for others, and they led on representation in consultations about the permanent memorial and remembrance services. As Vanessa mentioned, one of the members of the group, who is also a member of the team for this project, is also present here. So any questions you might have about the group itself, we can happily kind of discuss this at the Q&A later on. Now, why the need for archiving now? Obviously, the 20th anniversary in September 21 was a catalyst in prompting the group to consider the possibility or the options available to them and the directions they might want to take. Over the last 20 years, there's been a generational change in terms of who the members of the support group are. And we've seen new members, second generation members being now part of the support group. There's a concern about the risk to individual collections, all of these collections being in people's homes and kind of being more kind of personal or family archival documents rather than the group's archival documents. The founders are aging and want to preserve their materials for future generations. Hence, kind of one of the kind of the key considerations for that led to the project that we're going to talk about. And finally, one of the aims of, or at least the discussions that the group has had, was to find a public home for the group's materials. And this is a stage which we've been trying to, consideration that we've been having over the last kind of 12 months now, trying to find a suitable home, and we'll talk more about that later on. So this is the context of how the discussions about archiving disaster support groups records started. Sorry, one more thing I want to say before I talk about the project, which is what the material of the group includes, which is memorial and anniversary event invitations, programs, letters and photographs, information about ground zero development, invitation to the opening of the 9/11 memorial, donation letters and thank you notes, as well as committee minutes, group meeting minutes, and AGM records. And we'll talk a little bit more about the difficulty in understanding and reviewing some of the kind of the kinds and types of material held by the group later on. So I started saying that this was the context of the project that we are talking about today. So a team that Vanessa mentioned got together and kind of worked with members of the September 11 UK Family Support Group in understanding and articulating the motivations, aims, value, and use and challenges of forming an archive of this work. And this project was funded by the University of Manchester in 2022. So the guide, which is available now online as a website and as a PDF, is based on this experience that we've had over 12 months and the conversations we've had as a team, and also with the members of the support group. and consists of two parts. The first part is for disaster support groups and provides advice to them in terms of how they can form and look after an archive and deposit it with a public institution. And the second part is aimed at cultural professionals, archivists, museum, heritage professionals, academic researchers, who are considering embarking on a journey of acquiring an archive related to disaster or traumatic event, and importantly, working with support groups in the process. So now I'll hand over to Anne, who present the first part of the archive, and then Jen will do the second part. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you, Kostas. So I'm going to talk through, if you just go back one slide, Kostas, the first part of the guide, which is really aimed at members of disaster support groups. We can stay on this slide now. Who do we mean by that? Well, you've already had an example from Kostas of a disaster support group. That's bereaved family members in the UK from September the 11th. And what we mean by disaster support group is any group of people affected by the same disaster who come together for the reasons that Kostas illustrated in that 9/11 support group example. And so we also wanted to put in the guides just a working definition of what we mean by disasters, which for the purposes of our project and obviously for archiving, a reminder here that we're talking about collective trauma and how these can have long-term psychological and social impacts on members of the support groups that we are targeting our guide at over time. On your screen, you can see some examples from the UK of some of the kind of support groups that have come together after particular collective trauma events. Some are specific in place and time, 9/11 being an example, but others, as you see there, like the COVID family support groups and those working for justice after the COVID pandemic were spread over a number of geographical places, and indeed some are still suffering the impacts of long COVID. And you can probably think, as you see this slide, of similar examples in the US and elsewhere, where those who are bereaved and or are survivors, for instance, come together instinctively often to share experiences, sometimes to campaign for change, and sometimes to do educational prevention work. And that already highlights that the role of these groups, and thereby their archives and records, has a value not only to their members and their families over time, but also to wider society. They often tell a story about a tragedy and its political, social, cultural aftermath. Next slide, please, Kostas. So what we were trying to do in part one of the guide, and in focusing on disaster support group members for this guidance, really was to give them some insight into why they may wish to archive their material and how to really go forward practically with it. And as you can see in the intentions there, this is both, as indeed all the guidance in our guide, is not only about some practical tips, but also about addressing the very highly significant emotional context and emotional labour that archiving, or to be frank, even thinking about archiving involves. Can I have the next slide, please, Kostas? So what we've tried to put here, what I've included on the slide here, is just a sense, and thank you, Vanessa, for sharing the link to the guide in the chat box, just a sense of what's in this part of our guide. So I'd like you to imagine that you are a part of a group. You may be bereaved survivor, you may be both, you may be a family member who's linked in with a set of materials, and you're thinking about, well, why would I archive them? Should I archive them? What do I do with that? And so you can see in the bullet points here an indication of what the themes are within this part of the guide and the questions we ask people to think about. You know, why might I do it? What do they do? How can it help me? And how do you go forward? So again, it's thinking emotionally around starting this journey, and then practically about what that might mean in practice going forward. So let me just take a step back and say that it was mentioned in the introductions, as well as being an academic working in this area, I am myself a survivor from a disaster. So I'm in a support group for people affected by the Hillsborough disaster. That was a soccer stadium where 97 people were killed in a fatal crush over 30 years ago now. And as well as joining a support group, as Jelena did, I also joined another organisation called Disaster Action, which is where we helped to bring together later on 9/11 families to form their own support groups. And I have to tell you that as somebody who has been part of a support group and has my own personal collection of materials, as well as those within our support groups, I didn't know when I started this project where to go with thinking about where to archive my material. I have to tell you, I didn't know the difference between a curator, an archivist, a collections policy. To me, you're all just exhibitionists. I didn't know what that meant. And in practical terms, of course, that matters if I want to go down the journey of preserving our materials for future use. And so what you can see here is, some introductions that wouldn't be necessary for those on this call, but for those in support groups would want to know what a heritage organisation is, what do you do, and how do we start to make contact with you? And we've tried to include some practical templates going forward based on the fabulous experience and expertise within our working group. Next slide, please, Kostas. And what you can see here is just a snapshot, and I'll show you a couple of others in a moment, of what is included in the content of particular sections of this part of the guide. So I wonder why archiving may be a consideration. You can see that we've just got 3 summary bullet points there about what the material that's included in that section under that question. And what I really liked in working with a team like this is when we came to put the material into a really user-friendly practical guide, one of my colleagues suggested, we'll just have 3 bullet points at the start of a section that really sums up what's in there. I think that's really helpful, not only for making it user-friendly, but also I have to tell you, if you're going through opening up metaphorically and literally your boxes of emotional memories, you really can get bogged down in some of the details. So having things really easy to see and take in helps with that emotional process too. Next slide, please, Kostas. In this slide, then, you can see the 3 summary bullet points that highlight the content of the section on understanding the emotional significance. And really what we wanted to say here, and we found this as a project team in having meetings with members of the 9/11 UK Family Support Group, that it was very easy, even for ourselves, to think outside of this experience around the practicalities of archiving, setting up a meeting, etc. But we soon learned and appreciated that actually even coming to a meeting and starting to think about this is so deeply emotional that we really wanted to put that up front in the guide and really help people to work through the emotional side of it. May I have the next slide, please, Kostas? And then just one other example then, here you can see the 3 headline bullet points of the material that's included in this section of the guide, where we're asking who may be interested in your collection. So we suggest to people to think about and ask and start to have conversations with those who may be interested. And again, it's been a learning journey for me, as not being in the field that you are all in, to realise that there are many different potential audiences. And also from our experience, both with the 9/11 materials, with disaster actions materials, and with other materials from support groups, we've realised that finding a home may not always be easy. So the guide wants to help manage expectations around that in order for people, because of course having a rejection isn't just from your side that it may not be appropriate to your collections policy, but from our side it may be, well, you're not valuable, you're not valued, and nobody wants to remember and not forget. Just before we go on to the next slide, Kostas, then, my final slide, let me just illustrate this again from a personal point of view. So when I was involved in my disaster 30 or so years ago, like many people, I found myself instinctively collecting so many different types of material. And over time, I now have 3 very big cardboard boxes that I put on a very high shelf, because these are traumatic memories as well as ones that are sacred, in the sense that they need to be treated with special dignity and respect. And I was then asked by somebody who's doing an international exhibition on soccer, or football as we would call it, to share some of my materials. Can I share the next slide, Kostas? So when I came to open my box thinking, yes, I'd like to share my experiences through this international exhibition, you can see just a very small snapshot of some of the stuff that's in my disaster support box, if you like, of my collection, including the ticket from when I went to that fateful game that never happened that day, the match programme from the day, as well as various newspaper cuttings and all the stuff around the anniversaries and memorials that we've held every year. And I'm just going to finish my part of this presentation by just sharing how 3 examples of why the person I worked with who's organising this exhibition made such a difference to me, being able to share and wanting to work with people like yourselves in being part of an exhibition. The first point was that the curator really got to know me. We had a number of conversations over Zoom, and I learned to trust him. Otherwise, I would never let stuff out of my house. It's far too sacred and special to let go, even if I know I'm going to get it back. Secondly, in guiding me, he gave me a purpose. He said, don't open everything because it's very difficult emotionally to open the box. He said, open it with a purpose. And he gave me a list of things that he wanted and why he wanted them. And I have to tell you, that was both practically and emotionally so helpful. And thirdly, and perhaps a final key point for my part of the presentation, feeling that I could talk with somebody else and be in control over the decisions about what I might share and how it might be used or not was really valuable for this exhibition. And so finally, to sum up, part one of our guide then is for people who have been directly affected by a disaster, who are part of a support group and are thinking about why, what and how remembering for the future might be enabled through archiving. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Now Jen will talk about the second part of the archive.
Well, thank you all so much for having us today. So just to give a little bit of context, I joined the project as a curator and someone who does a lot of contemporary collecting and a lot of community engagement around adding new material to museum collections and adding new context to material which may be sitting in archives. And I'm sure that's something that many of you have experience of as well. But I very much came into this project with I suppose a lot of assumptions about how this project was going to work, about how the group would engage with the conversations we were having, but having a real lack of understanding, I suppose, of the huge sensitivities that needed to be considered before we embarked on this journey. A lot of the projects I work on are with communities who are incredibly passionate about their histories, about their stories. They can't wait to tell them, they can't wait to share them. And so this sort of beginning of a journey with those groups and that collaboration tends to be very open and very much led by the community. But it felt quite different in this case. And I think collectively we all learnt a huge amount. So if we go to the next slide, please, Kostas. So as Anne has outlined, the first part obviously was very much aimed at the groups themselves. So we wanted to then also frame all of this guidance and information from the perspective of those who work in the professional field and will potentially be the recipients of this material. There's so much to think of from both a practical perspective, but also from an ethical perspective in terms of the challenges that you may face when you're thinking about engaging with this type of material. And so this section of the guide is very much about giving insight into all of those conversations we've had to date that have really allowed us to fully understand what those sensitivities are and what should be considered, to therefore think about what are we asking of the group and how are we thinking about the ways in which these archives are defined and how they're audited and how we understand what the context of them is in order to then think about how they might sit within a home at an institution. And also then just thinking about what stages then we need to go through in order to find that permanent home for material, which, as Kostas mentioned earlier, has been a real challenge for this nature of content. So next slide, please. So communication and consultation really have been the most essential part of all of the work we've done so far on this project. As I said, we sort of came into this perhaps making some assumptions individually and collectively about how all of this process was going to work, but also a lot of assumptions about what people understand of our work. And as Anne says, you know, she was brilliant at interrupting in meetings and saying, so can you explain what that means? Don't just assume that we understand, you know, but with me saying, oh, we'll need to think about how this archive, this material might fit with a collections policy of an organization. You know, what does that mean? What does that mean to a group who are thinking very sensitively and are going to be quite defensive potentially at times about how they're having these conversations and where this material will end up? So yeah, it became very clear right at the beginning to not have any assumptions about the understanding that any of these groups and participants you might have engaging with you understand about how archives work, why they would want this material in the first place, and what might happen should they take this material. So thinking it also around sort of the control of this material and the management of this material was something that was flagged very, very early in our conversations. The group was really keen to understand you know, who is going to potentially see the material that they deposit with an organization? How will people access it? How will they access it? Can any restrictions be put into place? And so from a sort of archiving professional perspective, we obviously need to be thinking about what are those parameters and what is that flexibility to ensure that we're really meeting the needs of those who we're looking to engage with. There's also, you know, how we actually think about sort of unpicking all of this content and making sure that we're being really sensitive to the ways in which we approach engaging with any of this material. Like we can't just be asking, as Anne said, people to just open boxes and to start to look through things and tell us exactly what they have and what it represents and what the context is, in a way that maybe we would order other material which is less sensitive. All of this, you know, needs to have a conversation about how we approach this and how we ensure this is all being done as sensitively as possible. Next slide, please. Also, the definition of what this material is was really important to define. With many archives, we obviously do have the parameters over what we collect and what therefore fits within the remit of what can be housed within our certain institutions. And really defining that for an archive of this nature is quite challenging. There's lots of different people involved and people have collected over time in different ways. There's going to be duplication within some of those collections because this wasn't sort of a process that began with everybody sitting down and deciding what should be collected. This was very organic. This was done on an individual basis and, you know, very ad hoc. So some of it will be very personal, some of it will be quite thorough, some will be quite light touch, and some of it will contain duplication. So again, just really making sure that there's an openness as to what you are saying this archive actually contains and what it represents needs to be considered. And as we've referenced a couple of times now, just making sure that the support is put into place for when an auditing of this material is done. Not asking people, which is what we had initially done as part of this project, to just go and go through all their material and catalogue it in a simple spreadsheet so that we just had an understanding, is really difficult because we don't want to be doing that without the support that these groups need. And that's something that we've really learned as this project has evolved. But also there've been lots of questions throughout all of this process as well from the group about what, how this material might be used in the future, who will have access to it. And so preempting what that potential host organisation who will house this material might want or need is really difficult, because it's going to be so dependent on where it ends up. And we didn't want to be promising anything or managing expectations poorly by saying, that there will be opportunity for restrictions to be put on material, because it may be that there's just not the resource within certain archives for that to be possible. So there's lots of sort of sensitivity, again, just around what we're saying this material is and where it may sit. Next slide, please. Which brings us into thinking about how we find a home for material of this nature. It's very difficult to think about how we can sort of take the material in its current form and fit that into the remit of an organisation without too much disruption, both for the group and for the way in which their material has been stored and sort of archived to date, but also to make sure it fits within the institution and the resource that they have. And thinking about sort of how it's going to be cared for and how it's going to be used and what opportunity there may be for the owners of that material to really shape that and to really be thinking about this being an ongoing conversation about how archiving takes place. There isn't an expectation that material will simply be deposited and then all decision making about that material will then be done by the institution. But obviously that therefore means that resource really is required in order to be able to support that group and ensure this becomes a very collaborative process. So thinking about, who would be willing to put in the time to do this, who has the right skill sets, what support might the internal staff need in order to really ensure these relationships are built successfully and all of this is dealt with sensitively, just things to really be considered before a home is found. And I think through a lot of the conversations we've been having, the remit of the archive is complex because the group are mainly based here in the UK, but it's all based, obviously the context of the material is from an event in the US. The ways in which museums in this country sort of operate are quite locally specific or subject specialist specific, and that doesn't necessarily fit naturally with the way in which this archive has been developed. So there's lots of challenges to consider, and there may be some organisations who are very interested in taking it, but just simply don't have the capacity and resource to do this sensitively. So lots and lots for us to factor in. Next slide, please. Section, sorry. I will hand back over to Kostas.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. This is our final slide. Just to say that we've just launched the website of the guide, which includes a downloadable PDF with both parts of the guide in one document. As far as the project and the team is concerned now, we continue our work with the 9/11 UK Family Support Group in trying to find a home for this archive, also thinking about different ways, perhaps, of the possibility of the group looking it after over longer term. There's a possibility of forming a community archive around that, but without abandoning the plan to find a public institution where the archive is deposited, and at the same time also form a relevant or contribute to a relevant community of interest and explore future collaborative work and funding opportunities, both as far with regards to this particular archive, but also more broadly around disaster support groups and kind of developing archives around their materials. And we hope then to update our archive. We don't see this as a completed project, especially when it comes to finding a home. In many ways, this guide is based on the experience that we've had in working with the particular group, and we'd like to continue doing that. So we're going to update the guide based on how our kind of conversations and kind of the walk around finding a home evolve over the next period of time. But that was all from us for now. I'll stop sharing my screen, and Vanessa has kindly agreed to chair the Q&A and discussion for the kind of the last half hour. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much. It's such a fascinating topic, and especially to look at it from both the side of the individuals like yourself, Anne, who have been through these experiences and are in these groups and are approaching this, and then also from the side of museum and archive and cultural heritage professionals and how we can bridge those conversations. So thank you for having us all think about this today. So we do have some questions that are coming through in the chat. The first one is, timescales feel really important here. What's a realistic time for these discussions to start, or does it completely depend on the group impacted? I've seen some very immediate response to tragedy in terms of archiving, but examples like the 9/11 group show that it can take a generational shift.
Do you want me to start, Kostas?
Go on.
Yeah. Thank you. And I gather our colleague Jelena, who is part of the 9/11 UK Families Group, is in on the meeting too. And if you want to come in, Jelena, feel free. But let me just start by saying, in general, very general terms, it does depend, as Melinda has suggested, on the group and the nature of the impact. But generally, overall, it tends to take time for support groups. You know, in immediate aftermath of disaster, as you'll appreciate, there are many people around you, lots of support. So often people come together generally in the medium and longer term, and it takes time to build up materials with a view to having something to archive over time. So in general, we're talking about the medium and longer term, years rather than days and weeks and months. But of course, from the professionals' point of view, and this is another project that Kostas leads us all on, around gathering spontaneous memorials as also linked to, in the early stage of the disaster, some of the materials that might be collected and saved for later. From the professionals' point of view, it can be helpful to think from the beginning around this.
And just going to add to that, one of the, hopefully, one of the functions of the guides would be that support groups can start thinking about the possibility of developing an archive earlier on in the process. So at the moment of when if they decide to form a group in the first few meetings, maybe, I mean, obviously you cannot control that. You cannot have any control of what kind of groups are formed and where and when, but assuming that there is relevant conversations starting in as part of the group, then the existence of the archive, the guide might kind of help in framing some of those kind of questions. Are we going to develop something that for longer term, and if so, what are the steps and so on. So yeah, so kind of in some ways kind of bridging the professional with the support group kind of timescales here. I hope that kind of answers your question, Melinda.
Perfect. Terrific. So another question says, what additional considerations and challenges have you needed to address around acquiring and donating born digital and or audiovisual content? Yeah, so we haven't addressed that in the guide. So partly or largely because, as I said before, the guide is based on the experience of us working with the particular group. You're absolutely right, Somaya, that acquiring and donating born digital and audiovisual content would be as or even more important, especially in the future. And I'm going to ask Elena to come in to correct me if I'm wrong, but the most of the materials that we've that the 9/11 support group had is kind of paper-based, hence, and that kind of framed a lot of our discussions for this particular project. But you're absolutely right. We haven't. This is something that needs to be addressed too, and there is, thankfully, some really useful guidelines that have been produced by national and international organizations. Some of the national archives here in the UK has done a lot of work around that. I should also kind of mention the work of our working group in the States, of part of the Society of American Archivists, where as part of our crisis, disaster, and tragedy toolkit, the group has addressed some of those issues in terms of how considering again the kind of the challenges and practices around archiving born digital content. So this doesn't give you a direct answer to the question in terms of the considerations we've had, because we haven't had those kind of conversations with the group itself. But we acknowledge that this is a consideration that archivists and professionals will, and also the support groups will have, especially more recent formed groups. Is there anything else you want to mention, Jen or Anne?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I suppose one of the challenges is why we wanted to write it framed also for the perspective of those who would potentially acquire this material, is the fact that a lot of this is so unknown. A lot of these groups have been just collecting, not with heritage in mind, not with archiving requirements in mind. They've just been collecting things that are important to them, that they feel represent their story and are personally significant. And therefore, the format of that will be completely unknown at the point in which conversations are potentially being had around acquisition. So I think, again, just that need for resource, for openness, for collaboration, and also for managing expectation around what formats material could be acquired in and what the potential uses are, is just so important to be considering, that this isn't a straightforward sort of depositing of material. This is very much an ongoing conversation.
Can I make just two very quick practical points? One is it's not about born digital and audiovisual, but one of the things to illustrate about how people like us who don't understand about archiving have learned through connecting with people like yourselves. I learned through this project that newspaper cuttings are not very sustainable or don't last. I would never have folded all my things and thrown them in the box if I'd known that. So if you can early on, and you know, the expertise around knowing what different formats do and how to preserve them. And secondly, to build on Kostas's point, the multi-agency and the collaboration stuff is such that now I work in emergency management. To give an example, in the US, you have a lot of resiliency centers that set up now after a tragedy like the Pulse nightclub shooting. Now, the people running those centers may be involved in the earlier time with helping to form or support people who form support groups. So the professionals involved here could connect with those who are doing that to start thinking right at the beginning around this is what might be coming down the line.
Excellent point. Thank you all. Another question we've had come in is about funding. So how to fund these projects continuously after making so many efforts to make them happen and maintain them. The question asks if crowdfunding is a sustainable option or if there are other ways.
Yeah, so so one of the things that we found really useful, maybe not in the beginning of the project, but definitely towards the end of the project, is, and kind of almost a realization, is that this was not one of a case where you apply. I mean, we had a small amount of funding from the University of Manchester to work on this project, and then well, kind of we and obviously, you know, as all funding goes, kind of the funding finished, and there's usually kind of this kind of cliff edge where you there's nothing kind of following up. But what I was going to say here is that we realized that this kind of collaborative project needs to be ongoing, and it needs to be with the group and with the public institution. So in our project, we had a group, we had a team of people working with them. We did not have the institution. And this goes back to what Jen was saying about being unsure about the particular requirements and needs of a public institution. So the point that, our realization was that working with an institution from the kind of earlier on, or even in this kind of stage where we're looking for a home, is a much more sustainable way. Yes, funding is important, but funding outside the context of institutional collaboration, let's put it in this way, between a group and an organization becomes even more difficult if and when we manage to identify and have kind of fruitful conversations with an organization that would find meaning and value into and kind of ability to support the group by acquiring the archive. And I think funding then can follows on from that, in the sense that you can apply for funding collaboratively, jointly, and B, then the archive becomes part of that institutional kind of structure, institutional kind of funding streams, and so on, becomes part of their work. And I think this is for what we kind of realized kind of later on in the process, that funding is important, but it becomes easier when you have all the partners kind of present and interested in the process. And yes, in terms of crowdfunding, I think crowdfunding can be useful if a group wants to do this by themselves, or to manage the archive themselves, or they see that as a step towards preparing the archive in order to approach an institution, as a step towards a bigger goal. But that's my more limited understanding of how crowdfunding might work in this particular way.
Perfect. Thanks, Kostas. Well, I have a question of my own while we wait for some. Oh, never mind. Eleanor's beaten me to it. That's perfect. So as has Melinda. So starting with Eleanor, asks Anne, the experience you shared of the curator you worked with asking for specific material and explaining why they needed access to that specific material so you didn't have to open your full boxes was very helpful from a professional perspective. I would agree. Thank you. Do you have any other recommendations for working with members of a community and their material in ways that are respectful and mindful of the traumatic nature of that material?
Thank you, and thank you for your comment. Well, two comments really. One is that I know that Jen, for example, brought to our project a lot of experience and understanding of engaging with members of communities. So she might want to come in after this in terms of working respectfully with different communities. But I think the one I would pull up to illustrate, which is in our guide actually, I had help with our colleague Yelena, who is not only a member of the UK 9/11 Family Support Group, but is also a psychotherapist specialising in disaster mental health. And she helped me to talk through how to literally open my boxes of materials and go through them. And so what we had a conversation and we turned it into some bullet points that are in the guide, which is, how to go step by step to opening it, looking at the material, how you put it back, all of that sort of stuff. So, that's again the expertise of maybe a therapist or a counsellor or a good friend who understands, to have them alongside you while you're doing it. But then there's a wider question that Eleanor's question relates to, which is how do you work sensitively with members of different communities? And Jen, just by her presence and the way she works, also brought that into our conversations.
Oh, thank you, Anne. Yeah, I think that a lot of what we learned on this project was just around pacing ourselves and that communication just being so clear. So sort of almost me suggesting what might need to happen and have the group have the opportunity to push back on that and let me know what they were comfortable with. Excuse me 1 second. And yeah, not making any assumptions about how we work and not sort of doing a one-size-fits-all with everybody. So yeah, I think letting it be group-led as much as possible.
Terrific. Thank you both. So Anne, another question for you. Melinda says, although the trauma involved in this particular case makes it particularly challenging, it feels as if there's some valuable learning here about the ways heritage professionals deal with depositors in general. Given the emotional impact of deciding to talk with heritage institutions, the power dynamics of different knowledge levels in those relationships and understandings of professional expectations, et cetera, would you say that that's a fair reflection of your experience, Anne?
Definitely, and thanks for making the point, Melinda. And Kostas brought together a group of many different professionals in one of the conversations we had about this project, and many of those other colleagues made exactly the point you've made, Melinda, around generally. And I would say as a sociologist, with that hat on, that actually, people's stuff, let's look at the stuff around anything that we archive or collect or organize. I have Marie Kondo going through my head as I'm thinking of this. Anything we deal with is about not just the physical, but also the emotional, the symbolic, the cultural. It's about identity and all of that. So completely agree with you, Melinda. Anytime you're dealing with stuff, whatever it is around so many layers of meaning. Thank you.
I think we probably have time for one more question. So if there's someone typing, getting ready to get that in, we'll just hold for a moment. So not seeing anything pop up, I would ask, so I'm in a position where I also deal with support group records in my regular work here at the archive. And one thing that tends to come up is, that these groups are not monolithic, right? And individuals who experience a trauma may not have the same response or the same ideas or desires about how those materials are collected, aren't collected, used or not used. So I was wondering if any of you could maybe speak a bit to how you might navigate those sort of political conversations between different groups or conflict that may arise between individuals when going through this process.
Can I start by kind of saying, I mean, thanks very much, Vanessa, for this. It goes a little bit back to what we've been saying about giving it time and allowing time for those conversations to happen and to evolve, and largely as a way for members of the support groups to get their head around what this is all about, what an archive is and how it works and so on. We've had those kind of, I wouldn't say that in the beginning of the project we had negative reactions to the idea, but we had skepticism. I had lots of questions. We had perhaps some lack of interest in some ways, in the sense that I'm not quite sure what this is about. I'm not going to be engaged with it. But the more we kind of persevered in the sense of kind of giving time for people to discuss those kind of the possibility and the idea of an archive within the group, rather than with us in every single meeting, that was kind of also kind of very, very helpful. And having obviously Yelena, who was part of the team and also part of the group, was particularly useful in this case. So what I think we found is that if there were lots of different views, these were not necessarily became assimilated, but the group, by discussing more, understanding more what this is all about, they came into perhaps a shared understanding of the value and the need. Now, there might be still questions and differences in terms of practicalities and what kind of access and so on. But I think for us, the more important question was, how do we create a context and the platform for an equitable dialogue between the team and the group. And somebody mentioned in the comments about kind of equity here and kind of power relationships. I mean, it became, I think we realized quite early on that there is a kind of power dynamic that we needed to acknowledge and be addressed. And as I said, we did that by Yelena being the mediator between the two, let's say, groups, let's put it in this way, and also allowing time. Now, the latter is often quite complicated, because when organizations, specifically public institutions, public organizations, don't have necessarily the resources, the capacity, the time to dedicate to one particular project, one particular archive. I mean, this, and in terms of kind of having repeated conversations with individuals or groups, that might differ, depending on what organization we're talking about, and as I said, the resources and the capacity they have. But also sometimes what it doesn't help is when we reached out to to organizations, understandably, again, organizations have kind of processes and procedures and forms and templates that they use to ask you very kind of questions which are absolutely necessary and logical. What do you have? How many items? Are there duplications, so on? And presenting the group with this kind of form, I mean, we decided not to do that. We decided not to send forward the form to the group, but rather to fill it out ourselves, because that form, that way of communicating, perhaps becomes a barrier for a group to engage longer term with and really to engage with the process itself. I.e., understanding, is this for us? and how we're going to do it. Is there anything else you mentioned?
Can I just say, I'll keep it very brief, I know time is short, but I would just say that extending Kostas's point, that Vanessa, your question is so spot on, because in any disaster support group, for reasons you'll understand, there is likely to be difference, divergence, diversity, etc. There are hierarchies of grief and worth, which make all of the conversations even more loaded. And I think the takeaway from one example of that is to have clarity around, you know, what it is that you are archiving. Is it personal or is it the collective? So a disaster support group we worked with was a collective memory from which individuals had given or not into that shared thing. But the takeaway from all of this, and I think from the whole process of the guide really, is to complement thinking, process and procedure with thinking and feeling. So we come at it, everyone in this group that worked on this project was both process driven and procedural in the way things had to be done, but we were also very much in touch with thoughts and feelings. And that's the kind of consummate, compassionate professional who should be working in this space.
Yeah, just to build on Anne's point, defining sort of what we were saying this archive was with the group from the beginning, I think did really help and did allow us to make that distinction between the possibility of them parting with very personal material that they was related directly to their family member and that they couldn't even begin to conceive would sit outside of a private space for them, versus documenting what all of this important work that this group has done, and as like Anne said, what that collective experience therefore is. And I think we realized that quite quickly through those conversations, that is where a lot of that tension and nervousness sat around sort of, you know, how personal do we have to get here, and having that reassurance that actually the parameters of how we define this archive were completely open and flexible and led by that group, I think really helped to reassure and also helped us in terms of the way we communicate going forward with potential host institutions.
Terrific. Thank you all so much. And thanks to your colleagues who we didn't hear from today, but were so instrumental to this work. Echoing the sentiments from the chat, this was an incredibly useful and insightful session. And I'm so pleased that this is how we started our new speaker series for the Crisis, Disaster and Tragedy Response Working Group, which is a mouthful, but so glad to have you with us here today. And thank you to everyone that attended and asked questions and participated and took today's information in. As I mentioned at the start, we had recorded today's session. It will be available on the group's microsite in the coming days, so keep a lookout for that. And again, this is the first installment of our new speaker series. So our plan is to have 2 more events coming later in the year. Those will be announced on SAA listservs and also distributed through your group. So again, please join us in the future, and thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you again to Anne and Jen and Kostas for their talk. Have a lovely day, everyone.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you all so much.